Welcome to the Glenroy Theatre in Dunedin, the venue for a discussion about the future of driverless cars, being staged at a conference of the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia. I'm Ian Telfer, and with me here on the stage, in front of a lively audience of serious engineering professionals, is an impressive lineup of talent. From Copenhagen, we have the Danish futurist Liselotte Lundsø. She's joined by the motoring journalist David Thompson, Associate Professor James Maclaurin from Otago University, and the Deputy Chief Executive of the Ministry of Transport, Andrew Jackson. Our focus today is not so much on what the world might look like once we're all speeding around in our vehicles without any steering wheels and, dare I say it, without any brake pedals, but on how this actually might come to be. So we're calling this session The Road to Driverless Vehicles. But because this is such a vast topic and actually quite a quickly expanding one, I'm going to start by asking our panellists to each give us some introductory comments so that we know where they're coming from on the topic. And I'd like to start with you, David. David Thompson is an award-winning motoring journalist and editor of the Drive South magazine, the Otago Daily Times. And he's had plenty of first-hand experience driving and analysing these driverless cars. So over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Ian. So if we go back to 1939, at New York's World Fair, the hugely popular Futurama exhibit presented a world 20 years in the future, 1959-1960, where vehicles moved along automated highways. Work on autonomous motoring, autonomous highways, autonomous roads has continued since, and it really took off in the 1990s when the ICT revolution and digitalisation made a lot of new things possible in the space. In March 2004, a $1 million prize was up for offer to any team whose autonomous car could complete a 150-mile-an-hour course through the Mojave Desert. No vehicle managed to complete that course in the first of two Grand Challenge events. Yet, just 18 months later, in October 2005, 5 vehicles completed the second Grand Challenge. That's the month I visited the Honda test track in Japan and experienced autonomous motoring for the first time. So I did so from the driver's seat of an experimental Honda Accord. And there I sat, nervous but actually quite enthralled, with my arms folded and my feet off the pedals as the Honda Accord drove itself around the test track at high speed. 6 years later, in 2013, the production version of that Honda arrived in New Zealand. I made the front page of the Otago Daily Times by repeating the hands-free driving feat here in Dunedin on our southern motorway. Last year, I took one of my fellow panellists, James, out in the latest Mercedes E-Class. This is a car that can travel semi-autonomously on multi-lane urban roads as well as on motorways and highways. It can even execute its own passing manoeuvres. So off we went from the University of Otago, out to Mosgiel and back, with the car driving itself much of the way. Many new cars, including the current Ford Fiesta and Holden Commodore, can actually park themselves. Many more cars will sense an impending collision now. If appropriate, they will override the driver, they'll apply emergency braking and sometimes the steering to try and mitigate an accident or avoid it altogether. Many of the key technologies that a car must have to drive autonomously are sorted, but there are still some pressing technical issues to resolve. The first one, current self-driving systems rely on road markings to assess and maintain road position. Where they can become unclear, for example, due to rain, snow, grit on the road or whatever, a car can actually lose a sense of where it is on the road when it's trying to drive autonomously. And the last and most important thing perhaps to me is that current electronic guidance systems struggle to cope with the unpredictable and the chaotic. So, very quickly, how might this all play out in the transition to a Kiwi motoring future in which we can all be passengers? Since motorways have the least chaotic traffic flows and their markings and other features can be relatively easily optimised for autonomous vehicle guidance, that's where serious autonomous vehicle use will start. But I think many, many more years will pass before minor city streets and less trafficked rural and provincial routes can be autonomously driven. I suspect the take-up of autonomous vehicles for private use will be far slower than for public and commercial use. And of course, this vision assumes some quite challenging legal, ethical and social issues are sorted. That's something I'm not qualified to comment on, but I know the next member of the panel is. Thank you.
James Maclaurin is Philosopher of Science at Otago University, and he's the principal investigator on a project that's called Artificial Intelligence and Law in New Zealand, which has been funded by the Law Foundation. And I'll let him tell you the sorts of questions that they're asking.
So I was at a meeting the other day at the University of Otago. That's the sort of exciting life that I lead. There were lots of people there, 30, 40 people. It was a little bit fraught, high stakes. People were trying to do the right thing. Halfway through the meeting, this voice crops up. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that." We all thought that's a bit odd, and we looked round and we realised it's not a person at all, it's a laptop. And there's a laptop owner, and he's got this look on his face like nothing's happened, I didn't do anything, and anyway, I've turned it off, go back to your meeting. So we went back to our meeting. 2 minutes later, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that." And it's going off again. And this guy's furiously pressing keys, trying to turn it off. He's upgraded his laptop. It's got a personal assistant on it. He can't turn it off. I thought this was a lovely illustration of what it is that's interesting about artificial intelligence and that makes it very difficult to make predictions about the social side of artificial intelligence, about uptake, about speed with which we might see it on our roads. The thing that's front and centre here is something that philosophers call moral agency. So it's that thing that we've got that allows us to make moral decisions. We've got it, laptops haven't got it. Tables and chairs haven't got it. Cats and dogs haven't got it, just people. Now, if you're making an autonomous vehicle that's going to be whizzing around in a high-stakes environment, a high-risk environment like roads, then you'd like it to get moral decisions right. So what have you got to add? What's the secret sauce? What is this moral agency? If you ask a philosopher like me, I'll tell you it's a little bit complicated. There's a few things. So we have lots of beliefs, a wide variety of beliefs about the world that allow us to make inferences about the consequences of our decisions. Not just what's happening here and now, but what would happen to other people, maybe people in the future, people not present right now. So we're going to have lots and lots of beliefs. We have to have experience. So we experience the world, but we also experience what it's like being on the other end of other people's moral decision making. So I know what it's like when somebody helps me. I know what it's like when somebody's decision harms me. I know what pain feels like, or frustration, or things like this. So I need the right sort of experience. Also, you might think of moral agency as just a sort of skill. It's just like being able to catch a ball. Despite what it looks like on the news, I know it looks like mayhem out there. Actually, people are really good at making moral decisions. Almost all the people, almost all the time, get moral decisions right. Even when we don't really do what we ought to, we know we're not doing what we ought to. So, that's a laundry list of stuff. That's moral agency, you say? Well, I say it doesn't really matter, because look, it's a package deal. People have got all this stuff all the time. And that would have been a great answer about 5 years ago. And it's not anymore. So now we are making artificial intelligence that has some of this stuff, some of the time. So an autonomous vehicle knows lots just about the roads. So it knows about velocity and mass, and it knows the sorts of things. It can detect cars and trucks and people and this sort of thing. Does it know whether or not you should send your mum a card for Mother's Day? No. So we can't ask it anything outside that domain. So it's got a fairly narrow domain. Does it experience the world? Yes, in some sense, very well. Does it know what it's like to have a friend who loses their life in a traffic accident? No. So it doesn't have that sort of experience. Is it good at making moral decisions? Well, that depends a bit how we develop them and what sort of technologies that we use. But if we use machine learning and train them on a data set of human beings driving, they don't fall asleep. They don't get road rage. They're uniform and measured in their moral response. Maybe they'll be better than we are. So we've got a sort of moral agent. It used to be us and everything else. Now it's us and AI. And how do we treat AI? Which raises lots and lots of questions. So I'm just going to throw some questions out that we can talk about later. Liability. If my autonomous vehicle crashes through your front fence, who's responsible? Maybe it's made as well as the makers could make it. Are we going to treat this like an act of God? Are we going to push ACC out to cover damage to property, not just personal injury? Do we hold the makers liable? Do we know the makers made a good job of putting moral agency into the car? So, you know, you and I, we're people. So we can trust that we're able to make moral decisions, and we've got a backup plan. If we get it wrong, you can be fined. You can be sent to jail. There's no point in doing that to an autonomous vehicle. So we've got issues about moral responsibility. We've also got an issue about something called social license. If the whole country could vote, Would we want this technology? New Zealand, you might not know, is a poster child for social licence because as a whole country, we decided we didn't want nuclear weapons. That's social licence. You've got to have lots of information for social licence. We don't know enough yet to be able to hold the vote. But if we did, what would happen? Last thing, consumer choice. Are people going to want this? Will it be a labour-saving device? It's not now. When David drove down the southern motorway, he had to have his hands very near the wheel in case suddenly he was thrown back into control. If you bought a washing machine that while it went through its cycle, you had to stand in front of and think, good heavens, if it stops working, what am I going to do? Will I throw my hands in and wash the clothes? So it's not a labour-saving device at the moment. If it gets to be a labour-saving device and it's genuinely autonomous, is it going to be like an EV, like an electric vehicle that sells itself? You can charge a premium. People will still buy it. Or is it going to be like Google Glass? Worked perfectly, did what it said on the tin, nobody wanted one. Questions like these make or break technologies.
Andrew Jackson is Deputy Chief Executive at the Government's Ministry of Transport, and he leads there the Specialist Advice and Strategy area. And he tells me that one of the biggest questions for public policy that's coming is what happens to public transport when we have all these cheap cars without drivers. Andrew.
So when will we see these technologies? Mobile phones, we talk about these often as something that's been transformative and as a quick technology that's come to us. Well, first tested in 1973. First available for public sale in 1984. First iPhone, 2007. So you've got 30 or 40 years, and that was for a phone. I don't think it's going to come quickly, and we've heard that you've got technology already, that you can sit there and you can take over if needed, but moving to the place where we have driverless vehicles, I think we're looking further away. But will it happen? Do we want it to happen? 1.3 million people died last year in fatalities on the road. That's about the population of Auckland. The self-flying capability in aeroplanes is associated with a reduction in crashes of about between 70 and 90%. If self-driving vehicles can save even a fraction of that, up to 90% of the fatalities, is that something as a society we should want? I understand the ethical dilemmas we've got. I understand the issues around insurance, security. But if we can save 90% of 1.3 million people a year, is it something we should aspire to? And what does that mean for us? As I was growing up, though we didn't have the usual conversations about what someone was doing, it was more about if you were going to divide an apple pie equally into 5 pieces, how would you do it without using a protractor? Or what's the mathematical formula for calculating the number of dimples on a golf ball? So I've always liked to understand formulas, so I thought I'd throw some numbers at you to see if we can understand what might happen and how this technology might play out. And I looked at this for Wellington. If you just because Wellington's the place where there's most public transport use in the country at the moment, to see what the impact of this new technology might be on public transport. If you drive a car into town and you park, it costs about $24 a day to drive in and commute into Wellington. If you're coming from one of the closer suburbs. If you come by public transport, it's $10 a day. But despite that differential, 70% of people still drive. And that's because the calculation we make is cost, but also comfort and convenience. And comfort and convenience outweigh often cost. But what happens to cost in this new world? In this new world, the estimates are the cost of driving will plummet. And so the calculation is, rough estimate, that a daily cost of commuting to and from the centre of Wellington in one of these self-driving vehicles would be as low as $3 a day. So what would the impact be on public transport if it's a third of the cost to come in a self-driving vehicle? We can stand Canute-like and say we don't want these vehicles, but I think the figures suggest that there will be significant change. And so what are the implications as we look ahead? We may see a world where government no longer has to provide subsidies for public transport because fleets are provided that take us to and from the door at such a low cost. And that will have wider social implications. I don't know whether anyone in here in this room knows the average amount that a New Zealander walks per day. It's 9 minutes. We know we have a challenge with an obesogenic environment that leads to significant health costs. If each of us could just pick up our phone and within 2 minutes have a vehicle to take us wherever we want to go to, whenever we want to go to, we will have a world that wobbles even more. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Great stuff. Thank you, Andrew. Lastly, it's my pleasure to introduce our international guest this morning, Liselotte Lunso. She's from Copenhagen in Denmark. Lisa is a partner in an innovation and futurist company called Future Navigator. And she's been thinking about how this brave new world that we're talking about might end up unfolding in our lifetimes. Lisa.
It was such a pleasure talking to you yesterday, and afterwards I gave a lecture at the university and some students asked me some questions, and to me that's really what future studies is all about. It's finding out the interesting questions and not only stopping there, also asking ourselves, how do we prepare for this future? What do we need to train already now in order to have the competences once we see this? One of the students asked me, so Lisa, will we have a private or public car ownership? Because it's very neat that Andrew is giving everybody their cars, you know, these boring micro cars that all look alike and they come and pick you up. So it's a kind of an extended bus, a little more flexible. But what about the sexiness of cars? We will rather have the Airbnb of cars, so you upgrade your car, you buy a nice sports van and you have your surround music, and when you don't use it, you know, you rent it out to other people in your neighborhood and they love your car too. They take well care of it because it's your car, so you have this mutual rating system. And then what is going to happen? Are we then going to have more cars because people start collecting them like accessories, and there will be a great investment? Engineers are predicting that we will only need 20% of the cars because they go taxi driving and they are on the road, so we won't need as many. But we're not sure. Maybe the kids will not just have a smartphone at 7, but also their own driverless car zipping them around. And not just talk about these 68 generation growing old who wants, you know, to have a lot of material stuff. So nice massage cars that they can also use as hotel rooms. So are we sure that we're going to have less traffic out there? And also, who is going to be impacted by these driverless cars? It's not just a question of infrastructure. Maybe you're right now having a petrol station where you sell beverages to people or bread. Well, are we going to go to the petrol station when the driverless car is coming? No, of course, we'll send it to fill up itself. Petrol stations are not constructed for people. They are constructed for cars. So if that's your business model right now, you need to start thinking of changing that. How will you get your bread and beverages into these cars in the future? Because people won't come to petrol stations anymore. So I think that's another very important thing I would like our panels to think about. How is it impacting also other businesses than just the narrow thinking of the car? Thank you.
You're listening to RNZ and a panel discussion about the road to driverless vehicles recorded at a conference in Dunedin of the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia. Chaired by me, Ian Telfer from RNZ, it features the Danish futurist Liselotte Lunso and the motoring journalist David Thompson. We also have Otago University philosopher James Maclaurin and the Ministry of Transport's Deputy Chief Executive Andrew Jackson. David, can I start with you? How is this really going to start in New Zealand? Is it starting now, and who's going to be first? What sort of vehicles, what sort of people?
The sorts of countries that lead themselves to really high automation are countries with massive motorway networks and high traffic densities, and outside of Auckland we don't really have that. So I think it will start in a small way in New Zealand. I can see Auckland's northern or southern motorway being great with autonomous vehicles. I don't see how you're going to get an autonomous car going over the Crown Range from Wanaka to Queenstown anytime soon.
We can't get drivers to drive that road safely.
Well, absolutely. There's a lot of issues with the infrastructure of the road in terms of how you actually mark it out. And if you were designing roads from scratch for autonomous vehicles, I think we'd all agree you'd design them very differently. to the roads we're designing right now. So we're really going to, are we going to adapt to an existing road configuration and network? How far, or are we going to start again to some extent? And can we?
We're starting to see already, though, aren't we, driverless shuttles at the Christchurch airport, right? This year, I think it begins. So then what? Does it come to taxis? Does it come to trucks, farming? In New Zealand, what's the application?
You might imagine what's currently set aside as a bus lane on a motorway or major urban road being set aside for both buses and autonomous vehicles. You might see commercial vehicles driving autonomously, maybe at first not in mainstream rush hours, but out of rush hours, for social acceptance reasons. The car that we drove, James and I, the E-Class Mercedes last year, it could probably do 10 times more autonomously than it was actually allowed to do by Mercedes-Benz. So I think the technologies under there would have been there to allow it to do a whole lot more. But that technology has been restrained and being held back by the companies, particularly the likes of, I guess, the mainstream car manufacturers, but their reputations are really tied up in anything going wrong. And unlike Tesla, that can afford to have the odd glitch, which in the States resulted in a fatal accident, that's part of the technological progress for that company. The mainstream brands don't have that luxury.
I think it's important to think about the things that will drive uptake at least proximally, and one of those things is cost. So if you're a taxi company, the big cost that you face is your drivers. It's not your cars, it's the salaries. And so, you know, you've got one fare for one driver. It's not like a plane that's got, 200 fares for a couple of pilots and a few people serving the drinks. So it's a high cost for you. So we would expect that that's an area where commercially we would see a lot of push to something like driverless cars. And personally, socially, it's interesting because we're in a position where the sort of people who really want driverless cars, people who aren't old enough to drive, people who are too old to drive, people who have some sort of impairment that makes driving difficult for them, at the moment, driverless cars aren't useful for them. We need to get to that fully autonomous point. So we're sort of waiting for a tipping point at the moment, I think, when it comes to ordinary consumers wanting driverless.
But David, you think they're still going to have steering wheels and brake pedals even in the future?
Just as aircraft still have pilots that take control or can take control, and as James was telling me before, there's very, very few automated systems that have resulted in aircraft crashing because the automated system always hands back control to the pilot before the moment of disaster.
Andrew, are you thinking about this? Is the ministry onto this?
I think the point David's made is right. You'll see it in public transport. There are already autonomous trains around that are used, and there are a number of companies that are looking to find ways of using dedicated buses. But I do think it's the urban environments where you'll start to see these technologies deployed. The businesses themselves are investing massively in this area. As we know, they're trying to solve not just the question of how you get an individual vehicle to drive itself, but how to get fleets that will operate, that will provide a service. The cost issue means it's unlikely that we're all going to own them. I think I'd be interested in Lisa's views on that, but it does lend itself quite well to this concept of fleets that we plug into. And I don't think they'll be our first car, but rather than buying a second car that we'd have that's useful for when we need it, you still have your first car and then you have a second car for just the odd trip around town, and that's the way that we'll progress towards it.
When are you gearing up, though, as a ministry? When are you going to press go on this technology, do you think, Andrew? Like, when are you going to give that regulatory approval? How far away is that now for you?
One of the wonderful things about our legislation is we don't require a driver in the vehicle. I think we're reasonably unique in our legislation. It wasn't by design. We're not so foresighted. We knew when we set up the legislation.
You forgot to put the driver in, and now it's turned out to be foresighted.
Well, it's implied but not required in the legislation. So, of course, there are laws which require drivers to have certain capabilities, but we don't require a driver there. And from New Zealand's perspective, it's working out quite well because we're able to attract companies overseas to come and trial their technology here. And so I think that some interesting aspects about this is how we think about it socially, but economically, I think there's some quite significant economic opportunities for New Zealand through people bringing their technology and trialing them here.
Right now in Denmark, we have a municipality lying really in the countryside, and they have nurses driven around. I think you have the same bus in your airport driving without a driver, but they are now driving on the public road 25 kilometers per hour. And there is an advantage. First of all, they share notes when they drive together in this bus, and they can sit and work on the patients. And then we are getting these home hospitals where people are treated with telemedication, but then they need their checkups. And they use the bus for further flexibility, and they have calculated massive savings, especially in these rural areas. We don't have enough public transport, so it's fixing that.
What's going to happen to public transport? I can ask any of you this. I mean, what is going to happen, do you think, in the future with this?
Well, I think what is really, really important is that from a political viewpoint, that you start integrating mobility, so it's not either or, it's driverless car, but it's also sharing cars. We have 97% sitting alone in the car, so actually making an incentive structure for people to drive together. I think it's so important, and it's not coming by itself. We need very, very little barrier, and then we don't do it. So it needs to be completely smooth integrated. So you have to know exactly how to get from A to B, and you need extra incentive structure. If you want to move into the train, it should come with a breakfast buffet and a cafe latte.
But you believe people are going to keep buying and owning cars, don't you, Lisa? Because there has been an assumption that Uber is going to buy them all and own them all, or one of these big companies.
Yeah, we do scenarios on questions like that. There is a big group of people from whom it is a huge accessory. There's so much hedonism in the car business, and it's not going to go away overnight. But you can, either upgrade your car, but you can also lease very nice cars. But I think that sexiness factor is going to stay within the industry, otherwise they're really losing out.
The first thing that people want when they grow up is not a car anymore. It's one of these flashy tablet-type devices. And so social status and the way we connect is changing. It's quite important to understand that we're looking at different social changes. It's not just about the potential impact of transport, it's how we access things will change.
If nobody has the ownership, there is no belonging to it. So that's a problem of having this public transport. But the advantage is that you can then integrate the whole grid, so you know exactly the flow and you can control the flow. And one of the students yesterday was very worried about that future, because then they say it can be hacked, it can be used as a military weapon if all this fleet of mobility can be hacked because it's connected IT-wise. So that's a big dilemma as well. Should you have this perfect connection, or should we have a fragmented system of mobility?
The point you make is a very, very valid one, and it's interesting to see the different ways that different companies are thinking about how they deliver the service. And there's the connected versus the autonomous, and the connected is everything speaks to the infrastructure and the vehicles speak to each other, so they know there's a vehicle coming around the corner. Google, because of the security issue, have gone the other way, and their system is completely self-contained. And I was speaking to someone at Google. They said the page which is most attacked on the web is the Google homepage. And as a consequence, they're very aware of the security risks, so their Google car is self-contained and it doesn't communicate externally at all. So I think the issue you raise is an important one. The companies are trying to think about how to solve it.
Is that, maybe for you, James, is that potentially a problem, though? I mean, like any new technology or like any new development revolution, there are the things that drive it forward. There are also the things that hold it back. You talked about hacking. Are we going to have to wait for the first mass crash, the first mass meltdown of the system, the first big hacking event? And what happens then, James?
So at the moment, we're certainly waiting for lots of case law in the legal sense. We're just waiting for lots of cases. As lots of people will know, there was a death in a driverless car last year, but that was patently a car that was being inappropriately supervised. The guy had set cruise control far too high. He wasn't putting his hands on the steering wheel when the car beeped at him, things like this. So we need cases where accidents happen, where we see the costs as well as the benefits. I think that goes to all the issues that we're talking about. So it goes to privacy issues, it goes to liability issues. Privacy is very hard to predict. People are odd about privacy. We care a great deal about privacy in the physical world, and yet people care very little about privacy in the virtual world. At least they're very happy to be farming their data out to companies that are supposedly giving them services for free. So I think you're right. I don't think the mere fact that there are privacy implications of Tesla or somebody saying where you are, having that data. I don't think that will worry people. I think a meltdown in the system where that goes wrong and the machine learning comes to grief and there's a big crash, something like that, we'll have to learn about that and cope with that. Do we just do Andrew's calculation and say, well, in the old days, this many people died. Actually, now we're having fewer deaths on the road. In general, people are very influenced by psychological availability, that's what the psychologists call it, how visible harms are, whether they appear on the news, whether they look awful. That's why terrorism people think of as a terrible harm. It's nothing like as bad a harm as heart attacks or cancer. They're much, much more common, but people worry about things that are very visible. The same dynamic will play out, and hence the same decision-making structure will play out with things like autonomous vehicles. Got to wait for those big news stories, got to wait for those big events. We just can't predict it in advance.
One thing that's quite interesting is the concept of what safety is in this new world. In France, they're saying that they would allow these vehicles on the road if they're safer than humans. In the UK, they said they would only allow them on the roads if they are safe. So what do they mean by safe? Is that 0 fatalities? There is a bit of a race to the bottom on the regulatory side. So I was at the OECD Transport Conference a couple of weeks ago, and about three nations announced that they were getting rid of any law if companies would come and test in their country, because they want the economic benefit of the companies which produce cars in their country to be the ones that are successful. So there's a delicate dance that we've got to play, which is potentially there are massive benefits in the long run, but we may end up falling over our feet because we're rushing before we're ready to dance.
So there's two sort of juggernauts running toward each other at the moment, and one is this: we want the technology, we want the investment. The other one is concerned in particular about employment and the world of work, which of course is going to crash into all of this. And so what you have at the moment is the EU considering robot rights, which sounds like an odd thing to say, but it's not really robot rights. It's responsibilities for owners of robots. With the idea that firing a person and buying a robot that was much cheaper but would do exactly what the person did shouldn't be quite such a stark economic decision.
In Europe, the way they thought about it is, well, what are the social measures they should put in place to help people transition from having a job in that type of industry to another type of job? Well, in New Zealand, I think if the market's decided, you just have to cope. And I wonder whether we need to think in a different way rather than the way that we've thought before if we have significant impact from these technologies.
I'm so sorry. Women used to do washing by hands and doing the dishes by hands, and then we were set free, and then we could enter the labor market. Likewise, I would love for these truck drivers to spend their time on other things that might be more useful to society.
Well, shall we take some questions from the audience?
In Europe, you see something called covoiturage, which means ride sharing, where people are allowed to go online and share a ride from a destination to another, and you can actually see drivers' ratings, and that would build a bit of trust, for example, and allow you to choose which driver to go for. So is this something that has been considered in New Zealand or being considered soon?
There are rideshare companies like that operating in New Zealand, and people do rate their drivers on that. So that is operating already. Yeah, that's right.
If I can just talk about ride sharing, one of the barriers is that it takes a lot for me to leave my car at home and then pay somebody else to drive their car. So you need to create a new incentive structure. So leaving your car at home will reward you somehow. So driving with someone else to the supermarket or to the train station, that should give you a free tour to the swimming center or the cinema or whatever. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Everybody would like to open their car for other people, but actually leaving your own car at home, entering, it's scary, and the barrier is too big. So I think that's really key for this ride sharing, not moving further. It's the whole payment structure that we have today.
One of the things that is happening, though, as people are moving into the cities, is people are deciding whether they have a car or not. And I think so you're entirely right, where you've got a car, but where people don't have a car, it's becoming the way that people are deciding to move around rather than owning one.
I was just thinking about the very early days of cell phones, where the stereotypical cell phone user in the very early days was the merchant banker or the share broker. And we woke up quite surprised in New Zealand that it was all the tradies that had the cell phones because that was the huge economic benefit. And I wonder with autonomous vehicles, where the biggest gain is actually going to be in our heavy transport industry. In New Zealand, the first wave might be really big trucks. Are we ready for that?
Commercial vehicles are a really prime candidate for this, for economic reasons. And I think you'll also then see really serious automation, firstly in high-end cars. So it's going to be a little bit like the truckies and the merchant bankers, only there won't be truckies anymore, there'll be autonomous trucks. But there will be people with high disposable incomes, with premium luxury brands with the most autonomous cars, because that's where the technology will always start at, or will always start at the top end. Are we ready for it? Well, I guess that's a public acceptance issue. The one thing I'm struck by, actually having driven a number of semi-autonomous cars, is how quickly you become used to that technology as a user. So the first time I sat in that Honda Accord in Japan, it was quite terrifying, going around a track at 140 kilometres an hour with my hands off the wheel, my arms folded, my feet off the pedals. Now I've driven 1-2 dozen semi-autonomous cars. You get quite comfortable with allowing the vehicle to have a certain level of autonomy. It happens really, really quickly.
But people talk about the alertness problem, don't they, David? That you get the worst of driving, which is that you sit for hours looking at boring roads, right? Except you're supposed to be fully alert, ready to jump in and save this car before it crashes you. So how does that work in the meantime?
So I think that's why that's where the notion of a tipping point is really important. Because what we're doing right now is, with the current vehicles, is saying you can have your hands off the wheel maybe for 90 seconds, and then suddenly you've got to give 100% attention to the job. And then you're going to have your hands off the wheel for another 10 minutes, 100% attention to the job. It just doesn't work because you actually get distracted. And as Andrew said, the most dangerous moment might be when the technology tries to transfer back to the user. While the user's probably sitting there texting, as half the people in the world seem to do in their cars already anyway, a million miles away and is not in any state to regain control of the vehicle.
And if that person is driving a very large logging truck, do we not have a social problem while we bring this technology in?
Absolutely, because the biggest accidents will doubtless involve the biggest vehicles. Yeah.
I think the other thing, the other way to answer this question is to say that we're thinking about autonomous cars as cars. Are we sure about this? Because think about the cell phone example. We think about cell phones as phones, but actually most people don't use them as phones. My son never uses his as a phone. It turns out maps turned out to be really useful, having internet capacity. In future, the software that drives these cars is increasingly going to be made by companies like Alphabet and Apple. They're already jumping into this space. Then your car is going to be something just like that little constellation of things that you've got, your phone and your laptop and who knows, your watch. It's going to be part of that, plus your house, plus your car. So it's very hard for us to predict where the big wins are, because it's not just going to be about a thing that gets you from A to B with you having to pay less attention but some attention. It's going to be a whole culture change in the way that we use technology, and that really has barely started yet. The sort of companies that are going to be driving this aren't really in this space. At the moment, it's really being driven by swanky car companies, by Mercedes, by Tesla, things like this. When it's driven by software companies, all bets are off.
In the near term, it seems that we need cars that would drive themselves in ways that would match the way that the human drivers are driving cars. Whereas it would seem pretty natural to expect that in the far term, we need vehicles that are for their occupants, very different in how they're driven from how cars are driven at present. Is this a problem for the transition itself?
I think it's such a good point that you're making. Thank you for that. People are afraid of flying, and it's actually the safest mode of transport, but it's because we lose control, as you say. We can't open the window, we have to sit in, fasten the seatbelt, and hope for the best, and that's why it's not very pleasant to be a passenger in a car as well. So you're completely right, it's not a rational feeling, and surveys seem to show that people get nausea from being in a driverless car. So we might, for that, have the Google Glasses scenario.
I had an interesting experience on the way to the airport in Wellington, and the driver of a taxi car, you could have put a piece of tissue paper between the front of his car and the car in front. I didn't feel safe. And we each have different expectations of how we drive. The way these vehicles will move, I'm sure, will be very different, recognising that we'll all be throwing up otherwise.
If you are heading towards this driverless car mode in the future, is it time for now to consider even your road network needs to be designed for that sort of facility?
So yes, it is absolutely essential to think about the implications of these emerging technologies for the infrastructure. One of the things they're doing in Singapore, which I quite like, where they're putting car parks in, they're locating their car parks where they think the pools of self-driving vehicles will operate from, and they've got the routes going into and out of those car parks so they would flow really well if they were a load of self-driving vehicles. So there are other countries where they're starting to think about, well, how do we design the infrastructure so it will match the technology that's emerging? And one of the difficulties that we have today is our cities of today were designed on the transport needs of the past. And so we then have to try and solve the transport needs of today with cities that just don't work. So you're right, we need to look ahead to understand how the transports will change and transport demands will change so we can design the infrastructure to match it.
It's worth remembering that when they invented the Segway, I don't know who's been on a Segway. There's a few hands. I've been on a Segway. They're fantastic.
Those are those things that have, what, just two wheels?
Just two wheels, self-balancing.
Self-balancing.
You don't really have to be doing anything. They just kind of go where you will them to go.
They look like they defy the laws of physics, don't they?
Wonderful thing. So when they were first invented, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, said, these are amazing things, and one day people will redesign cities around them. And what he should have said was, these are amazing things, and if we're going to use them, we'll have to redesign cities around them. We didn't redesign cities around them. They are great things, cool things. Nobody uses them. Occasionally, sports events, you see them rarely. So, this is a question for us. And it's one of those imponderables about how fast we will change the infrastructure. As Andrew points out, there's a natural lag, and it's quite a big lag. So it's a hard question.
Do we need to think about that? Do we need to think about not just what are the vehicles going to look like and who's going to own them, but like what are all the other implications for cities, roads, infrastructure? I mean, all those sorts of things. Are we thinking big enough, Andrew?
I think we're starting to. We've developed a range of scenarios, and the future really is not certain. And one of the design principles that we have is you keep your options open, so you design things to allow options. An example, the route between Auckland Airport and the centre of town. For a long, long time, people will say, we'll put rail in. Well, we don't know whether rail will be the best way, but what you do want to do is to make sure there's a good corridor and then perhaps start with buses, maybe guided buses, and then it keeps the option open if the demand there is needed, rather than putting rails down straight away when we may find in 5 or 10 years people are not using it. So keeping options open is absolutely crucial.
Just another observation in respect of that. It's a moot point as to whether you adapt your cities and your infrastructure or you completely rebuild them. So if we look at current motor vehicles and we contrast two different environments, we might contrast most European capital cities, which have their origins in the medieval ages and were actually not designed for cars, they were designed for pedestrian and animal transport, and contrast what they've been able to do around infrastructure for cars compared to, say, Los Angeles, which is a city designed around the automotive age, or Chicago, where they've basically been able to develop the entire infrastructure to suit a particular mode of transport. I think one of the issues we've got now is there probably aren't too many greenfield cities where we're going to have the luxury of developing infrastructure from the start for autonomous cars. I mean, maybe in the world of science fiction on another planet somewhere, but not on this planet.
James, how hard is this going to be for our society to cope with in the next 30 years, as we look forward? How difficult, how traumatic, or how exciting?
Well, so I was giving a talk yesterday to a group of career guidance people up in Auckland, and we sat down and said, what are the big problems that are facing us as a world, and how much are these technology problems and how much are these social problems? So world of work, hacking of democracy, climate change, all sorts of things going on. This is a big thing, but there are lots of big things that are coming. So I think we're getting better at coping with change. I think paradoxically, the rate of change is helping us because we have really great design companies that are building software that now appears in our phones and laptops and that will be running our cars and our homes. So there is going to be demand. The question is, what will we use it for? Where will the demand be? I'd love to say I've got a quick answer and an easy answer. We don't. We just need lots of research, both in what you do and in what we do, the social side.
Right, I'm afraid that that's really all we've got time for today. I'm sure this debate could keep going, and it will keep going. Let me thank our guests for their contributions to this panel discussion on the road to driverless vehicles. From Denmark, Liselotte Lunso, motoring journalist David Thompson, Otago University Associate Professor James Maclaurin, and the Deputy Chief Executive of the Ministry of Transport, Andrew Jackson. This recording was made in association with the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia. I'm Ian Telfer for RNZ, and thanks for being with us.